Hey guys, tonight we descend into the blood-soaked, honor-obsessed, and occasionally completely unhinged world of medieval Japan, where loyalty, death, and absolutely no concept of reasonable limits collided in spectacular fashion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me tell you, what we're diving into today makes Viking berserkers look like anger management graduates. Picture this: you reliving in an age where your entire identity was defined by a code so rigid it made modern military discipline look like casual Friday, where death wasn't just preferable to dishonor, it was practically a hobby, and where the concept of taking things too far simply didn't exist in the vocabulary. In this world, loyalty wasn't just expected. It was demonstrated through acts so extreme that modern psychologists would have a field day writing case studies. Let's be clear about something right off the bat. When we think of samurai, most of us conjure up images from Hollywood. Noble warriors with impeccable honor codes, graceful sword fights, and a sort of dignified stoicism that makes them seem almost monk-like. That's roughly equivalent to thinking all Vikings were horn-helmeted barbarians who solved every problem with an axe. Sure, there's some truth buried in there, but the reality? The reality was so much weirder, so much more psychologically complex, and frankly, so much more disturbing than anything Hollywood has ever dared to show us. The samurai class, which dominated Japanese society from roughly the 12th to the 19th centuries, developed a culture of ritualized violence that went far beyond simple warfare. We're talking about a warrior aristocracy that turned suffering into an art form, loyalty into a death cult, and honor into something so twisted that it would make a modern cult leader blush. These weren't just soldiers. They were participants in an elaborate theater of pain that would make the Spanish Inquisition look restrained. Now, you might be thinking, come on, how bad could it really be? After all, every warrior culture has had its extreme elements. The Spartans threw babies off cliffs. The Aztecs ripped out hearts. And don't get me started on what the Romans did for entertainment. But here is the thing, and this is what makes samurai culture uniquely fascinating and terrifying. They didn't just engage in extreme violence against enemies or criminals. They turned that violence inward, creating elaborate rituals of self-torture, family sacrifice, and competitive suffering that served no military purpose whatsoever. To be fair, understanding these rituals requires us to grasp something fundamental about medieval Japanese society. It was built on a foundation of absolute hierarchy that makes modern corporate structures look anarchic. Imagine a world where your social position was determined entirely by birth, where moving up the ladder was virtually impossible, and where the only way to prove your worth was through increasingly extreme demonstrations of loyalty to your superiors. Sound familiar? Well, maybe if you've ever worked for a particularly toxic startup, but multiply that by about 1,000 and add samurai swords. The psychological pressure in this system was immense. Samurai weren't just warriors. They were living symbols of their lord's power, their family's honor, and their own spiritual purity. Every action was scrutinized, every failure magnified, and every moment of weakness could result in not just personal disgrace, but the complete destruction of your family's social standing. In this environment, extreme behavior wasn't just accepted, it was necessary for survival. But here's where it gets really interesting and really disturbing. By the time the Tokugawa shogunate established peace in the early 1600s, Japan entered what historians call the Great Peace, nearly 250 years without major warfare. Suddenly, you had a warrior class with no wars to fight, but with all the same psychological pressure to prove their martial virtue. What do you do when you're trained for violence but have no enemies to kill? That's right, you turn the violence inward. You create increasingly elaborate rituals of self-harm, family sacrifice, and competitive suffering. You transform what should have been a peaceful period into a psychological arms race of extreme behavior. It's like if Navy SEALs were forced to spend decades in office jobs but still had to prove they were Navy SEALs every single day. Eventually, someone's going to start doing push-ups on broken glass just to feel relevant. The rituals we're about to explore weren't aberrations or the actions of a few disturbed individuals. These were accepted, encouraged, and often mandated practices that were woven into the very fabric of samurai society. They were performed by some of the most educated, cultured, and philosophically sophisticated people of their time. Men who could compose exquisite poetry, appreciate the subtle beauty of a tea ceremony, and discuss Buddhist philosophy with profound insight. The same men who would ritually disembowel themselves if they arrived 5 minutes late to a meeting. And yet, before we get too judgmental about these historical practices, let's pause for a moment of uncomfortable self-reflection. We live in an age of extreme sports where people regularly risk death for Instagram photos. We have reality TV shows built around psychological and physical torment. We have corporate cultures that glorify working yourself into the hospital. We have social media platforms that turn public humiliation into entertainment. Maybe we're not so different after all. The difference, of course, is scale and institutionalization. What we're about to explore wasn't just individual extremism. It was systematic, culturally mandated extremism that lasted for centuries and shaped one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations. These weren't isolated incidents of weird behavior. They were the logical endpoints of a value system that prioritized abstract concepts like honor and loyalty over basic human survival instincts. Still, I want to be absolutely clear about our approach here. We're not going to glorify these practices or treat them as exotic entertainment. These rituals caused real suffering to real people, destroyed families, and created a culture of psychological trauma that persisted for generations. But understanding them, really understanding them, gives us insight not just into medieval Japan, but into the human capacity for both nobility and horror, often expressed in the same act. So buckle up, because we're about to explore a world where loyalty was measured in blood, honor was demonstrated through suffering, and the line between civilization and barbarism wasn't just blurred. It was completely erased. And if you thought modern life was stressful, just wait until you meet people who considered ritual suicide a form of stress relief. Let us start with what might be the most foundational of all samurai rituals, the blood oath ceremonies. Now, when I say blood oath, you might be picturing something like a pinky swear, but with slightly more dramatic flair. Maybe some theatrical pricking of thumbs, a few drops of blood mixed in sake, everyone feeling very serious and bonded. Think again. Samurai blood oaths were elaborate theatrical productions that would make modern team-building exercises look like casual coffee meetings. We're talking about ceremonies that could last for days, involve multiple forms of self-mutilation, and create bonds so intense that participants regularly died for each other, sometimes literally within hours of the ceremony. Let's be honest, the psychology behind these rituals was sophisticated in a deeply disturbing way. The medieval Japanese understood something that modern corporations spend millions trying to figure out. Nothing creates loyalty like shared trauma. When you bleed together, suffer together, and risk everything together, you create bonds that transcend normal human relationships. It's the same principle behind military boot camp, fraternity hazing, and yes, cult indoctrination. The most common form of blood oath ceremony was called keppen, which translates roughly to blood seal. But calling it a blood seal is like calling a tornado a windy day. Technically accurate, but missing the full terrifying scope. A typical keppen ceremony began with days of preparation involving fasting, purification rituals, and meditation on death. Participants would compose death poems, write final letters to their families, and engage in ritual cleaning that bordered on obsessive-compulsive behavior. To be fair, the attention to detail was impressive. Every element of the ceremony had symbolic meaning, from the type of paper used for the oath document to the specific location where blood was drawn from the body. The most prestigious ceremonies used paper made from mulberry bark that had been purified through specific rituals, ink made from pine soot that had been blessed by Buddhist monks, and brushes made from the hair of sacred animals. But here is where things get truly weird, and this is a pattern we all see throughout samurai culture. They turned even their blood into a competition. Different regions developed different standards for what constituted an acceptable blood oath. In some areas, a simple cut on the finger was sufficient. In others, participants were expected to cut open their arms or chests. By the late medieval period, some ceremonies required participants to mix their blood with that of their ancestors, blood that had been preserved, sometimes for generations, specifically for these occasions. Sound familiar? We see the same escalation in modern contexts all the time. What starts as a simple corporate retreat becomes a week-long survival exercise in the wilderness. What begins as a fraternity initiation becomes a dangerous hazing ritual. What starts as a social media challenge becomes increasingly extreme versions that send people to the hospital. The human need to one-up each other doesn't change. Only the context does. The psychological manipulation involved in these ceremonies was remarkable. Participants weren't just swearing loyalty. They were literally inscribing it with their own blood while in a state of ritualized trance. The combination of fasting, sleep deprivation, physical pain, and group pressure created an altered state of consciousness that made participants susceptible to making commitments they might never have made in normal circumstances. Meanwhile, the social dynamics around these ceremonies became increasingly complex. By the Edo period, blood oath ceremonies had become such an important part of samurai culture that failing to participate could end your career, while participating badly, showing fear, hesitating, or fainting could be even worse. Young samurai found themselves in situations where they had to regularly engage in acts of self-mutilation just to maintain their social standing. The irony here is profound. These were ceremonies ostensibly designed to demonstrate loyalty and trustworthiness, but they created an environment where deception and performance became necessary for survival. Samurai developed techniques for making dramatic cuts that looked severe but weren't actually dangerous. They practiced fainting gracefully if they couldn't handle the pain. They learned to fake the transcendent spiritual states that were supposed to accompany the ceremonies. That's right. Even their sacred blood rituals became subject to the same social pressures and performative dishonesty that plague modern social media. The difference was that instead of faking perfect lives on Instagram, they were faking perfect devotion with actual knives. The most extreme form of blood oath ceremony was called Kegare, which involved not just blood, but the cutting and sharing of actual flesh. Participants would carve small pieces of skin from their bodies and burn them as offerings to their lord or to the group bond they were forming. The ashes would then be mixed with sake and consumed by all participants. Yes, you read that correctly. Ritualized cannibalism as a team-building exercise. Of course, the practical problems with this approach were obvious to everyone except, apparently, the people doing it. Shared blood ceremonies are an excellent way to spread diseases, something that didn't escape the notice of more medically informed participants. By the late medieval period, some regions had developed elaborate protocols for purifying blood before sharing it, involving everything from blessed salt to specific incantations designed to ward off evil spirits and illness. The tragic thing is that these ceremonies often worked exactly as intended. They created bonds of extraordinary loyalty and devotion. Samurai who had participated in blood oath ceremonies together would indeed die for each other, follow each other into exile, and maintain their commitments even when it meant destroying their own families. The rituals were psychologically effective precisely because they were so extreme. And yet, This effectiveness came at an enormous cost. The culture of blood oath ceremonies created a warrior class that was increasingly disconnected from normal human emotional responses. Men who could calmly carve up their own flesh as part of a bonding exercise were not necessarily the best equipped to make rational decisions about diplomacy, economics, or family relationships. Still, before we get too comfortable feeling superior to these historical practices, let's consider some modern parallels. We have military units that engage in blood-pinning ceremonies, where insignia are literally driven into flesh without anesthesia. We have corporate retreats that involve firewalking, glass-walking, and other forms of ritualized ordeal. We have sports teams that bond through hazing rituals that regularly send people to the hospital. The samurai weren't unique in understanding that shared suffering creates group cohesion. They were just more honest about it, and more extreme in their execution. Modern society has the same psychological mechanisms. We've just learned to disguise them better and add legal disclaimers. By the time the Meiji Restoration ended the samurai era in 1868, blood oath ceremonies had become so elaborate and extreme that they were consuming enormous amounts of time and resources. Some samurai were spending more time on ritual bloodletting than on actual martial training or administrative duties. The ceremonies had evolved from practical bonding exercises into elaborate theatrical productions that served no purpose except perpetuating their own existence. If you thought modern corporate culture had a problem with meaningless rituals and performative loyalty, think again. At least your team-building exercises don't literally require you to bleed for the company. Yet. Now, if blood oath ceremonies were the appetizer in the banquet of samurai extremism, then the practice of Junshi, ritual following in death, was definitely the main course. And by main course, I mean the kind of meal that makes you question not just your dining choices, but your entire understanding of what constitutes reasonable human behavior. Junshi, which literally translates to following in death, was the practice of loyal retainers committing suicide upon the death of their lord. But calling it suicide is like calling the Titanic a minor shipping incident. It misses the full scope of the psychological, social, and practical insanity involved. Let's be clear about what we're talking about here. This wasn't a spontaneous outbreak of grief-driven self-harm. This was an institutionalized system where the death of one person regularly triggered the deaths of dozens, sometimes hundreds of others. Imagine if every time a CEO died, half the company's management team ritually killed themselves, and you start to get a sense of the scale we're dealing with. The practice reached its peak during the late medieval and early Edo periods, when the deaths of major daimyo, feudal lords, regularly resulted in what can only be described as mass suicide events. When Tokugawa Ieyasu died in 1616, multiple retainers committed Junshi. When his son Hitada died in 1632, even more followed. These weren't isolated incidents of individual devotion. They were organized, planned, and socially expected mass deaths. To be fair, the logic behind Junshi made sense within the twisted framework of samurai values. If your entire identity was built around serving your lord, what happened to that identity when your lord died? If your purpose in life was to protect someone who was now beyond protection, what was your continuing purpose? From this perspective, Junshi wasn't just about loyalty. It was about existential coherence. But here is where things get really disturbing. And this is a pattern we all see throughout our exploration of samurai culture. They turn even mass suicide into a competitive performance. Different retainers would compete to demonstrate the most spectacular forms of devotion in death. Some would commit seppuku, ritual disembowelment, at their lord's funeral. Others would starve themselves to death over weeks or months. Still others would engage in increasingly elaborate forms of self-torture before their final act. Sound familiar? We see the same competitive dynamics in modern grief culture, though thankfully without the mass suicide element. Think about how social media has turned mourning into a performance where people compete to demonstrate who is closest to the deceased, who is suffering most deeply, and who can craft the most moving tribute post. The samurai just took this natural human tendency to its absolute logical extreme. The social pressure involved in Junshi decisions was immense. Retainers who chose not to follow their lord in death faced not just social ostracism, but complete destruction of their family's honor. Their children would be unmarriageable, their property could be confiscated, and they would be excluded from all aspects of samurai society. In many cases, choosing to live was actually choosing a form of social death that was arguably worse than physical death. Meanwhile, the families of potential Junshi participants found themselves in impossible situations. Wives had to choose between encouraging their husbands' suicide, thus destroying their families, or discouraging it, thus destroying their family honor. Children had to watch their fathers contemplate suicide and somehow respond appropriately. Showing too much emotion could be seen as weakness. Showing too little could be seen as callousness. The psychological toll on samurai families was enormous. Many households developed elaborate protocols for dealing with the possibility of Junshi situations. Some families maintained detailed plans for how property should be divided, children cared for, and family honor preserved in the event of the father's ritual suicide. It was like having a perpetual suicide plan hanging over every household, not because anyone was depressed, but because social circumstances might require it at any moment. That's right. These families were living in a constant state of potential catastrophic loss, not because of any external threat, but because of their own cultural values. It's difficult to imagine the psychological stress of raising children in an environment where your father might kill himself at any moment because his boss died, and this would be considered not just acceptable, but honorable. The most tragic aspect of Junshi culture was how it affected children and adolescents. Young samurai grew up knowing that their primary adult role models might suddenly vanish not because of war, disease, or accident, but because of honor obligations. This created a generation of people who were psychologically prepared for sudden abandonment as a normal part of life. Of course, the practical problems with institutionalized mass suicide were obvious to anyone with basic administrative skills. When significant numbers of experienced retainers killed themselves every time a lord died, it created massive disruptions in governance, military command, and economic management. Entire domains could be thrown into chaos not by external attacks, but by their own loyalty customs. And yet, the practice persisted for centuries because it served important political functions for the ruling class. Mass Junshi demonstrations were spectacular displays of a lord's power and the loyalty he commanded. They served as warnings to potential rivals and reassurances to allies about the strength of a domain's internal cohesion. In a political system based on personal loyalty rather than institutional structures, these displays of extreme devotion were valuable political theater. The irony here is profound. A practice that was supposedly about selfless devotion actually served the selfish political interests of the living. Dead lords couldn't benefit from their retainer's suicide, but their heirs certainly benefited from the impressive display of family loyalty. Junshi was as much about political messaging as it was about genuine devotion. Still, before we get too comfortable judging these historical practices, let's consider some modern parallels. We have military traditions where soldiers are expected to die rather than abandon their posts or surrender their flags. We have corporate cultures where executives are expected to fall on their swords when their companies fail. We have political movements where followers are expected to sacrifice their careers, relationships, and sometimes lives for abstract ideological principles. The difference is scale and literalness. Modern loyalty culture relies more on metaphorical death and social sacrifice, while samurai culture demanded the real thing. But the underlying psychology, the expectation that true loyalty requires ultimate sacrifice, remains remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. By the mid-17th century, the Tokugawa government began actively discouraging Junshi because the practice was becoming economically and politically disruptive. The 1663 death of Tokugawa Isuna prompted so many Junshi suicides that the government actually banned the practice, threatening severe punishment for anyone who committed it and their families. But here's the fascinating part. Even after it was banned, samurai continued to engage in modified forms of Junshi. Instead of actual suicide, they developed rituals of symbolic death involving exile, religious retreat, or elaborate forms of penance. The need to demonstrate ultimate loyalty was so deeply embedded in samurai psychology that they couldn't simply stop the behavior. They had to find socially acceptable alternatives. If you thought modern corporate loyalty culture was intense, just be grateful that your boss's death doesn't come with an expectation of ritual suicide. Although, given some of the severance packages I've seen, maybe economic death isn't that different from the real thing. Moving from the group dynamics of blood oaths and Junshi, let's dive into something even more psychologically disturbing: the individual rituals of purification that samurai used to cleanse themselves of spiritual contamination. These practices, collectively known as Kegare Harai, make modern self-care routines look like gentle suggestions rather than life or death imperatives. The concept of Kegare, spiritual pollution, was central to samurai psychology, but understanding it requires grappling with a worldview that was simultaneously sophisticated and completely unhinged. Samurai believed that certain actions, experiences, or even thoughts could contaminate their spiritual essence, making them unfit for their duties as warriors and potentially endangering everyone around them. The solution? Ritualized self-torture designed to purge the contamination through suffering. Let's be honest, the intersection of Buddhism, Shintoism, and warrior culture created a perfect storm of psychological complexity that would make modern therapists weep. On one hand, you had Buddhist teachings about compassion, nonviolence, and the interconnectedness of all life. On the other hand, you had a warrior class whose entire identity was built around violence and domination. The solution? Elaborate theological justifications for why violence was actually a form of spiritual purification. The most common form of purification ritual was called mizagi, which involved exposure to extreme physical conditions designed to shock the system into spiritual clarity. But samurai mizagi wasn't your garden variety spiritual retreat. We're talking about practices that included standing under freezing waterfalls for hours, sitting in meditation while being stung by insects, and fasting to the point of hallucination, all while maintaining perfect mental composure. To be fair, the psychological theory behind these practices wasn't entirely irrational. The samurai understood that extreme physical stress could produce altered states of consciousness that might be interpreted as spiritual insight. Modern science confirms that severe physical stress can indeed produce euphoric states, mystical experiences, and profound psychological changes. The problem was that the samurai took this insight and ran with it straight off a cliff. The standard purification ritual for a samurai who had killed someone, even legitimately in battle, involved a complex series of physical ordeals designed to purge the spiritual contamination of taking life. This might include days of fasting, ritual scarification, exposure to extreme temperatures, and forms of self-flagellation that would make medieval Christian penitents look restrained. But here's where things get truly bizarre. They developed different purification protocols for different types of spiritual contamination. Killing an enemy samurai required one type of ritual cleansing. Killing a peasant required another. Accidentally causing someone's death required yet another. Being present at someone's death, even natural death, required purification. Even witnessing violence could require cleansing rituals. Sound familiar? We see the same obsessive categorization in modern anxiety disorders, where people develop elaborate rituals to deal with different types of perceived contamination. The difference is that we recognize this as psychological dysfunction, while samurai culture institutionalized it as spiritual wisdom. The social dynamics around purification rituals were particularly toxic. Samurai were expected to recognize their own contamination and voluntarily undergo cleansing, but they were also expected to police each other as spiritual state. This created a culture of constant surveillance, where any sign of spiritual pollution could trigger demands for public purification rituals. Meanwhile, the definition of spiritual contamination kept expanding. By the late medieval period, some schools of samurai thought considered it spiritually polluting to eat certain foods, visit certain places, associate with certain people, or even have certain thoughts. The purification rituals became correspondingly more extreme and more frequent. That's right. They had created a system where normal human experience was considered spiritually dangerous, and the solution was systematic self-torture. It is like if modern hygiene culture decided that any contact with germs required immediate chemical burns to prevent contamination. The cure became worse than the supposed disease. The most extreme form of purification ritual was called gomadan, which involved ritual burning of parts of the body as offerings to purge contamination. Participants would burn small sections of skin, hair, or even fingertips as sacrificial offerings. The pain was considered essential to the purification process. Suffering without physical evidence wasn't considered effective. Of course, the medical consequences of these practices were predictable and horrible. Repeated ritual burning led to serious infections, permanent disfigurement, and sometimes death. Extreme fasting caused malnutrition and cognitive impairment. Exposure rituals resulted in frostbite, heat stroke, and other environmental injuries. But these medical consequences were often interpreted as signs that the purification was working. If it didn't hurt, it wasn't purifying. And yet, the most disturbing aspect of purification culture wasn't the physical suffering. It was the psychological framework that made the suffering seem rational. Samurai developed elaborate theological justifications for why spiritual contamination was more dangerous than physical injury, why purification suffering was more beneficial than medical treatment, and why extreme rituals were more effective than moderate ones. The irony here is devastating. These were often highly educated, intellectually sophisticated people who could engage in complex philosophical discussions about the nature of existence, morality, and human purpose. The same men who could appreciate the subtle aesthetics of poetry, tea ceremony, and flower arrangement were also convinced that burning their own flesh was necessary for spiritual health. Still, before we get too comfortable feeling superior to these historical practices, let's consider some modern parallels. We have fitness cultures that glorify extreme physical punishment as character building. We have therapeutic practices that deliberately induce trauma to process psychological issues. We have spiritual movements that require various forms of self-denial and physical ordeal. The samurai weren't unique in believing that suffering could be spiritually beneficial. They just took this belief to its logical extreme and institutionalized it as a social requirement. Modern culture has the same underlying assumptions about the relationship between suffering and purification. We've just learned to moderate the intensity and add medical supervision. By the Edo period, purification rituals had become so elaborate and time-consuming that they were interfering with actual military and administrative duties. Some samurai were spending more time purifying themselves than performing their official functions. The rituals had evolved from practical spiritual hygiene into elaborate performances that existed primarily to demonstrate the performer as spiritual sophistication. The competitive aspect of purification culture was particularly destructive. Different samurai would attempt to demonstrate superior spiritual discipline through increasingly extreme purification rituals. What started as personal spiritual practice became a form of public performance where the goal was to outsuffer your peers. If you thought modern wellness culture was obsessive about purification and cleansing, just be grateful that your juice cleanses don't involve actual burning. Although, given the price of some modern wellness retreats, maybe economic suffering is the contemporary equivalent of spiritual purification through physical pain. If purification rituals were about cleansing individual spiritual contamination, then the practice of honor competitions, what historians call Gaman Kurabae, was about publicly demonstrating your spiritual strength through competitive suffering. These events make modern extreme sports look like recreational activities designed by overprotective parents. Let's be clear about what we're dealing with here. Honor competitions were unoccasional events or the activities of a few extremists. They were regular social gatherings where samurai would compete to see who could endure the most pain, the most discomfort, or the most elaborate forms of self-torture while maintaining perfect composure. Imagine if your neighborhood block party centered around a contest to see who could smile most convincingly while being systematically tortured. The psychological logic behind these competitions was both sophisticated and completely deranged. Samurai believed that true strength wasn't demonstrated by what you could do to others, but by what you could endure yourself. The ability to suffer without showing weakness became the ultimate measure of warrior virtue. Pain tolerance wasn't just a useful skill, it was a moral quality. To be fair, there was a certain twisted nobility in this value system. Rather than celebrating the ability to inflict suffering, samurai culture celebrated the ability to absorb it. Rather than glorifying dominance over others, they glorified mastery over self. It's a philosophy that sounds almost enlightened until you see what it looked like in practice. The most common form of honor competition was the Subo Gaman or endurance contest. Participants would subject themselves to various forms of controlled torture, sitting on sharp objects, holding painful positions for extended periods, or allowing others to inflict specific injuries, while judges evaluated their composure and stoicism. Winners weren't determined by who lasted longest, but by who showed the least reaction to pain. But here's where the competitive element became truly disturbing. Participants began developing innovative new forms of suffering specifically designed to impress audiences. Simple pain endurance evolved into elaborate performances where the creativity of the torture became as important as the stoicism of the endurance. Samurai would design custom instruments of self-torture, develop new techniques for maximizing pain while minimizing visible reaction, and create theatrical presentations around their suffering. Sound familiar? We see the same dynamic in modern social media culture, where people compete to post increasingly extreme content for attention and validation. The difference is that instead of competing for likes and followers, samurai were competing for social status and marriage prospects through public self-torture. The social pressure around these competitions was immense. Young samurai who refused to participate or who performed poorly faced social ostracism and career limitations. Families would spend significant resources training their sons in pain tolerance techniques, hiring experts in various forms of endurance, and developing strategies for competitive suffering. Meanwhile, the competitions themselves became increasingly elaborate social events. By the late medieval period, major honor competitions attracted audiences from across entire regions with elaborate ceremonies, formal judging procedures, and significant prizes for winners. These weren't informal gatherings of tough guys showing off. They were formal social institutions with rules, traditions, and economic impacts. That's right, they had created an entire economic system around competitive self-torture. Merchants sold specialized equipment for honor competitions. Experts offered training in pain tolerance techniques. Entire communities organized their social calendars around these events. It was like if modern extreme sports had evolved into a central feature of civilization rather than a niche entertainment industry. The most extreme form of honor competition was called Gaman, or death endurance contests. Participants would engage in forms of torture that were potentially fatal, with the understanding that showing any sign of weakness, including dying, would be considered a loss. These contests had mortality rates that would make modern extreme sports look like children's playground games. Of course, the practical problems with institutionalized competitive self-torture were obvious to anyone with basic medical knowledge. Participants regularly suffered permanent injuries, disabilities, and deaths that served no military or social purpose. Entire generations of young samurai were being systematically damaged in pursuit of abstract honor points. And yet, the practice persisted because it served important psychological functions within samurai culture. Honor competitions provided an outlet for the intense competitive drives of a warrior class that spent most of their time in peacetime administrative roles. They offered a way to demonstrate martial virtue without actual combat. They created clear hierarchies based on demonstrable skill rather than birth or political connections. The irony here is profound. A culture that claimed to value life, honor, and service was systematically destroying its own members through pointless competitive suffering. The pursuit of honor had become so abstracted from its original purpose that it was undermining the very people it was supposed to strengthen. Still, before we get too comfortable judging these historical practices, let's consider some modern parallels. We have competitive eating contests where people regularly hospitalize themselves for entertainment. We have endurance sports where athletes knowingly risk permanent injury for temporary glory. We have social media challenges that regularly send participants to emergency rooms. The difference is that we generally recognize these as optional recreational activities rather than essential social requirements. Samurai honor competitions were career necessities, family obligations, and community expectations all rolled into one package of systematic self-destruction. By the mid-Edo period, honor competitions had become so elaborate and dangerous that some domains began regulating them like modern governments regulate dangerous sports. Rules were established about acceptable forms of torture. Medical personnel were required at major events, and age restrictions were implemented to prevent children from participating in potentially fatal competitions. But here's the fascinating part. Even when authorities tried to moderate these practices, participants found ways to escalate them. When certain forms of torture were banned, competitors developed new ones. When safety requirements were imposed, participants found ways to make compliance more dangerous than the original activities. The competitive drive had become so strong that it overcame even basic self-preservation instincts. The psychological toll on families was enormous. Parents had to watch their children engage in potentially fatal activities as normal social participation. Spouses had to support their partner's participation in competitions that might leave them permanently disabled. Children grew up thinking that public self-torture was a normal part of adult life. If you thought modern helicopter parenting was intense, just imagine having to train your children in advanced pain tolerance techniques because their social acceptance depended on it. At least modern competitive parenting usually doesn't involve actual physical torture. Usually, moving from individual competitive suffering to family dynamics, we encounter perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of samurai culture: the rituals that required family members to sacrifice their lives for abstract concepts of honor. These practices, collectively known as Ie-shi or family death obligations, made modern family dysfunction look like minor disagreements over holiday dinner plans. The core principle behind family sacrifice rituals was that individual honor was inseparable from family honor, and family honor was more important than individual survival. This sounds almost noble in the abstract. The idea that family members would support each other unconditionally, that they would share in each other's successes and failures, that they would face difficulties together as a unit. The reality was far more disturbing. Family sacrifice obligations meant that when one family member committed a serious breach of honor, whether through military failure, political mistake, or social transgression, the entire family was expected to pay the price, often with their lives. Let's be honest about what this looked like in practice. When a samurai failed in his duties or brought disgrace to his lord, it wasn't just his own life that was forfeit. His wife, children, parents, siblings, and sometimes even distant relatives were expected to commit suicide to demonstrate the family's acceptance of responsibility for his failure. We're talking about mass family suicide as a normal response to individual mistakes. The most common form of family sacrifice ritual was Ie-shi, collective death, where entire families would commit synchronized suicide using elaborate protocols that had been practiced and refined over generations. These weren't spontaneous acts of desperation. They were carefully choreographed performances that could take days to complete and involve dozens of people. To be fair, the logic behind collective family responsibility made sense within the twisted framework of samurai social organization. In a system where individual identity was completely subsumed into family identity, individual failure genuinely did threaten the entire family's social existence. If your family name became associated with dishonor, every member would face social ostracism, economic ruin, and marital impossibility. But here's where things get really disturbing. They developed elaborate protocols for determining which family members were required to die and which were allowed to live. Age, gender, social position, and relationship to the disgraced family member all factored into complex calculations about who had to pay the ultimate price for someone else's failure. Sound familiar? We see the same toxic family dynamics in modern dysfunction, where one person's problems become everyone's crisis, where individual mistakes trigger family-wide consequences, and where family members are expected to sacrifice their own well-being for the family's reputation. The samurai just took these dynamics to their logical extreme, literal death instead of metaphorical sacrifice. The psychological pressure on children in these family systems was unimaginable. Young people grew up knowing that their parents, siblings, or even they themselves might be required to commit suicide at any moment because of someone else's actions. They had to learn elaborate suicide techniques, not because they were suicidal, but because family honor might require it. Meanwhile, parents faced impossible choices about how to prepare their children for potential family sacrifice situations. Do you teach a 10-year-old the proper techniques for ritual suicide? Do you help them practice death poems? Do you explain why they might need to die because their uncle made a political mistake? These weren't hypothetical questions. They were practical parenting challenges that samurai families dealt with regularly. That is right. They had to develop child-rearing strategies that included suicide preparation as a normal part of growing up. It's difficult to imagine the psychological impact of raising children in an environment where death wasn't just a natural possibility, but a potential family obligation that could be triggered by external events completely beyond anyone's control. The most tragic aspect of family sacrifice culture was how it affected relationships between family members. Husbands and wives couldn't fully trust each other because either one's failure could doom the entire family. Parents couldn't entirely love their children because they might have to kill them or watch them kill themselves. Children couldn't completely rely on their parents because family obligations might require abandoning them. Of course, the practical problems with institutionalized family suicide were staggering. When entire families killed themselves in response to individual failures, it created massive disruptions in property ownership, economic relationships, and social networks. Entire communities could be destabilized by the ripple effects of family sacrifice events. And yet, the practice persisted because it served important social control functions. The threat of family-wide consequences for individual actions created powerful incentives for conformity and careful behavior. When your mistakes could literally kill your family, you were motivated to avoid mistakes. When your success could save your family, you were motivated to succeed. The irony here is profound. A system designed to preserve family honor was systematically destroying families. The pursuit of abstract concepts like loyalty and reputation was taking precedence over the most basic human bonds of love and protection. Still, before we get too comfortable judging these historical practices, let's consider some modern parallels. We have families destroyed by one member's criminal activity, where everyone suffers financial and social consequences for individual actions. We have family businesses where one person's failure can bankrupt entire extended families. We have political families where one member's scandal affects everyone's career prospects. The difference is that we generally don't require literal death as penance for family failures. We just destroy people economically, socially, and psychologically instead. Maybe the samurai approach was more honest about the real costs of collective family responsibility. By the late Edo period, family sacrifice rituals had become so economically and socially disruptive that some domains began offering alternatives. Exile instead of death, economic penalties instead of suicide, or elaborate public penance rituals that demonstrated shame without requiring actual fatalities. But here's the fascinating part. Even when alternatives were available, many families continued to choose death because the alternative penalties were considered more shameful than suicide. Social death was considered worse than physical death, economic ruin more terrible than family annihilation. The competitive aspect of family sacrifice was particularly destructive. Different families would compete to demonstrate the most spectacular forms of collective devotion in death. What should have been private family decisions became public performances, where the goal was to outsuffer other families in crisis. If you thought modern family drama was intense, just be grateful that your family dysfunction doesn't come with suicide requirements. Although, given some of the family dynamics I've observed, maybe emotional death isn't that different from the physical version. From individual family destruction, we move to something even more systematically disturbing: the seasonal blood festivals that transformed the natural rhythm of agricultural life into a calendar of ritualized violence. These events, known as Ketsumatsu-sai, make modern Halloween celebrations look like gentle community gatherings designed by pacifist kindergarten teachers. The concept behind seasonal blood festivals was that the natural cycles of death and renewal in agriculture needed to be reflected in human society through corresponding cycles of violence and purification. This wasn't just metaphorical. Samurai communities developed elaborate festivals where actual human bloodshed was synchronized with planting seasons, harvest times, and weather changes. Let's be clear about the scale we're dealing with. These were isolated rituals performed by a few extremists. They were community-wide celebrations that could last for days or weeks, involve hundreds of participants, and feature enough bloodshed to require specialized cleanup crews and medical personnel. Imagine if your town's harvest festival centered around systematic self-torture instead of pumpkin carving. The most common form of seasonal blood festival was the spring Chinagashi, or blood-flowing ceremony, designed to ensure good harvests by demonstrating human willingness to sacrifice for agricultural success. Participants would engage in various forms of ritual cutting, bloodletting, and scarification, while prayers were offered for crop fertility and weather cooperation. To be fair, the psychological logic behind connecting human sacrifice to agricultural success has deep roots in human culture. Societies around the world have developed rituals linking human suffering to natural abundance, based on the idea that the forces controlling nature require demonstration of human commitment and sacrifice. But samurai communities took this universal human tendency and developed it into something uniquely extreme and systematically organized. They created detailed calendars correlating specific types of bloodshed with particular agricultural needs. Different seasons required different forms of sacrifice. Different crops required different types of human offering. The summer festivals were particularly intense, featuring netsuchi, or heat blood ceremonies, where participants would endure various forms of burning and heat exposure, while offering their suffering for protection from drought, floods, and crop disease. These events combined religious ritual, agricultural superstition, and competitive self-torture into spectacular community celebrations. But here's where things get really disturbing. Children were not just observers of these festivals, they were active participants. Young people were expected to demonstrate their commitment to community welfare through age-appropriate forms of ritual suffering. We're talking about systematic child abuse, disguised as religious education and community participation. Sound familiar? We see modified versions of these dynamics in modern contexts, where children are expected to participate in adult religious or cultural practices that may not be psychologically appropriate for their developmental stage. The difference is that we generally don't require actual bloodshed from elementary school students as part of community celebrations. The social pressure around festival participation was enormous. Families who failed to participate adequately faced community ostracism and economic consequences. Business relationships, marriage prospects, and social standing all depended on demonstrating appropriate levels of commitment to seasonal blood offerings. Meanwhile, the festivals themselves became increasingly competitive and elaborate. Different communities would attempt to demonstrate superior devotion through more spectacular forms of collective suffering. What started as simple agricultural rituals evolved into complex performances designed to impress neighboring communities and attract political attention. That is right. They had turned agricultural superstition into a form of regional competition where the goal was to outsuffer neighboring communities. It is like if modern county fairs were judged based on how much the participants were willing to torture themselves for better crop yields. The economic impact of these festivals was significant. Communities invested enormous resources in festival preparation, specialized equipment for ritual activities, medical care for participants, and cleanup operations afterward. Some regions spent more on seasonal blood festivals than on actual agricultural improvements like irrigation or fertilizer. Of course, the medical consequences of community-wide ritual bloodshed were predictable and horrible. Festivals regularly resulted in serious infections, permanent disabilities, and deaths that served no practical purpose. Entire communities would be weakened by their own religious celebrations. And yet, the practices persisted because they served important psychological and social functions. The festivals provided shared experiences that bonded communities together. They offered outlets for collective anxiety about agricultural uncertainty. They created clear seasonal rhythms that gave meaning and structure to community life. The irony here is devastating. Communities that were supposedly demonstrating their commitment to life and prosperity were systematically weakening themselves through pointless self-destruction. The pursuit of agricultural success was undermining the very human resources needed to achieve that success. Still, before we get too comfortable judging these historical practices, let's consider some modern parallels. We have music festivals where attendees regularly hospitalize themselves through dehydration, drug use, and crowd crushes. We have sporting events where fan behavior results in riots, injuries, and deaths. We have Black Friday shopping events that feature actual violence over consumer goods. The difference is that we generally recognize these as unfortunate side effects of otherwise positive community activities, rather than as the main point of the celebrations. Samurai seasonal festivals deliberately centered the violence and suffering as essential elements of the observance. By the late Edo period, seasonal blood festivals had become so elaborate and expensive that some communities began struggling to afford them. The festivals had evolved from practical agricultural rituals into massive community productions that consumed enormous resources while serving no clear agricultural purpose. But here is the fascinating part. Even when communities tried to scale back the festivals or eliminate the blood elements, participants insisted on maintaining the traditional levels of violence and suffering. The festivals had become so embedded in community identity that removing the extreme elements was seen as abandoning community values rather than improving community health. The competitive aspect of festival culture was particularly destructive. Different age groups, genders, and social classes would compete within festivals to demonstrate superior commitment through more extreme forms of participation. What should have been inclusive community celebrations became hierarchical displays of competitive suffering. If you thought modern community festivals were intense, just be grateful that your local harvest celebration doesn't require ritual bloodletting for good weather. Although, given some of the prices I've seen at craft fairs, maybe economic sacrifice is the contemporary equivalent of agricultural blood offerings. Moving from community-wide violence to the systematic brutalization of children, we encounter the apprentice initiation practices that transformed the education of young samurai into a program of institutionalized trauma that would make modern military training look like summer camp activities designed by child psychologists. The samurai apprentice system, known as Kashin-rei, was based on the principle that true warriors could only be created through systematic exposure to extreme physical and psychological stress from childhood. This wasn't just tough love parenting. This was a comprehensive educational philosophy that treated child abuse as character development. Let's be honest about what we're dealing with here. Samurai apprentice training began as early as age 5 and involved regular exposure to violence, pain, and psychological manipulation that was designed to eliminate normal human emotional responses and replace them with absolute obedience and pain tolerance. Imagine if kindergarten was run by drill sergeants with a background in psychological warfare. The most common form of apprentice initiation was the Hajimari Kiri, or beginning cutting ceremony, where children as young as 6 or 7 were required to inflict deliberate injuries on themselves as proof of their commitment to warrior training. These weren't minor cuts. We were talking about wounds that required medical attention and left permanent scars. To be fair, the logic behind extreme childhood training wasn't entirely irrational. The samurai understood that psychological conditioning was most effective when applied during childhood development, and that extreme situations required extreme preparation. Modern military and athletic training programs use modified versions of the same principles. But here's where things get truly horrifying. They developed age-appropriate torture techniques, specifically designed for children. Different forms of pain and suffering were calibrated for different developmental stages. What constituted appropriate suffering for a 7-year-old was different from what was expected of a 12-year-old or a 16-year-old. The psychological manipulation involved in apprentice training was sophisticated and comprehensive. Children were systematically isolated from normal family relationships, taught to suppress natural emotional responses, and conditioned to find pleasure in pain and pride in suffering. Modern cult indoctrination techniques pale in comparison to the comprehensive psychological restructuring involved in samurai childhood education. Meanwhile, the families of apprentice samurai found themselves complicit in the systematic abuse of their own children. Parents were expected to support and encourage the brutal training of their sons, to withhold comfort when children suffered, and to demonstrate approval for increasingly extreme forms of childhood trauma. Sound familiar? We see modified versions of these dynamics in modern contexts, where parents sacrifice their children's well-being for competitive advantage, extreme sports training, child beauty pageants, academic pressure, and entertainment industry exploitation. The difference is that we generally recognize these as problematic rather than as ideal character development. That is right. Samurai culture had normalized child abuse to such an extent that parents competed to demonstrate who was willing to subject their children to the most extreme forms of suffering. It was considered good parenting to facilitate your child's systematic traumatization. The most extreme form of apprentice initiation was the shi-kokoromi, or death trial, where children were required to experience near-death situations as part of their training. This might involve near drowning, near suffocation, extreme exposure, or other controlled life-threatening experiences designed to eliminate fear of death. Of course, the mortality rates for these practices were horrific. Significant numbers of children died during apprentice training, but these deaths were often interpreted as evidence that the child wasn't suited for samurai life, rather than as evidence that the training was dangerously extreme. And yet, the most disturbing aspect of apprentice culture wasn't the physical abuse. It was the psychological framework that made the abuse seem loving and beneficial. Adults genuinely believed that subjecting children to systematic trauma was the kindest thing they could do for them, that preparing them for a violent world required violent preparation. The irony here is profound. A culture that claimed to value children and family was systematically destroying childhood and normal family relationships. The pursuit of warrior excellence was undermining the very human foundations that should have motivated that excellence. Still, before we get too comfortable judging these historical practices, let's consider some modern parallels. We have youth sports programs where children regularly suffer serious injuries in pursuit of competitive excellence. We have academic systems that drive children to suicide through competitive pressure. We have entertainment industries that systematically exploit child performers. The difference is that we generally recognize these as unfortunate consequences of otherwise positive activities, rather than as the deliberate goals of childhood development. Samurai apprentice training explicitly aimed to traumatize children as a form of character building. By the Mid-Edo period, apprentice initiation practices had become so extreme and expensive that some families began seeking alternatives. Private tutors who used less violent methods, modified training programs that reduced physical trauma, or delayed entry into formal samurai education. But here's the fascinating part. Even when alternatives were available, many families continued to choose the most extreme training options, because moderate approaches were seen as inadequate preparation for adult samurai responsibilities. The culture had become so invested in trauma-based education that gentler approaches were seen as setting children up for failure. The competitive aspect of apprentice culture was particularly destructive. Different families would compete to demonstrate their children's superior toughness through more extreme training experiences. What should have been private family decisions about childhood education became public displays of competitive child abuse. If you thought modern helicopter parenting was intense, just be grateful that your childhood education didn't require systematic self-torture for basic literacy. Although, given some of the student loan debt I've seen, maybe economic trauma is the contemporary equivalent of warrior training. From childhood trauma, we move to perhaps the most psychologically complex of all samurai rituals, the death poetry competitions, where participants would compete to compose the most beautiful and meaningful verses while preparing for their own suicide. These events, known as Jisei-kai, transformed the ultimate human experience into a form of competitive performance, art that would make modern poetry slams look like casual book clubs. The practice of composing death poems, Jisei-no-ku, was based on the Buddhist principle that one's final moments revealed one as true spiritual development and poetic sophistication. But samurai culture took this contemplative practice and turned it into a competitive social event where participants would gather specifically to compose death poetry while planning their actual deaths. Let's be clear about what we're dealing with here. These weren't metaphorical exercises or dramatic performances. These were actual suicide preparation sessions where participants would spend days or weeks crafting perfect final statements while making concrete plans for their deaths. Imagine if your local writer's workshop centered around suicide notes instead of short stories. The most common form of death poetry competition was the Jisei-kai or death poem contest, where participants would compose verses about their impending deaths, while judges evaluated the poetry for technical skill, spiritual insight, and emotional sophistication. Winners weren't necessarily expected to follow through immediately, but the assumption was that everyone present was actively contemplating suicide. To be fair, the artistic quality of samurai death poetry was often extraordinary. The combination of genuine proximity to death, intense spiritual contemplation, and competitive pressure produced some of the most beautiful and profound poetry in Japanese literature. When you're literally facing death, your artistic priorities tend to clarify remarkably. But here is where things get deeply disturbing. They developed elaborate aesthetic theories about what constituted superior death poetry, with different standards for different types of suicide, different seasons, different ages, and different social circumstances. The aestheticization of death became so sophisticated that it started to eclipse the actual experience of dying. The psychological manipulation involved in death poetry culture was subtle but comprehensive. By treating suicide as an artistic opportunity rather than a tragic loss, the competitions normalized and even romanticized death in ways that made participants more likely to see suicide as an attractive option rather than a last resort. Meanwhile, the social dynamics around death poetry competitions created impossible pressures for participants. Those who composed beautiful death poetry were admired and celebrated, but they were also expected to eventually follow through on their artistic promises. Those who composed mediocre poetry faced criticism not just for poor artistry but for inadequate spiritual development. Sound familiar? We see the same dynamics in modern social media culture, where people compete to post the most dramatic and attention-getting content about their personal struggles. The difference is that instead of competing for likes and shares, samurai were competing for social status and artistic recognition through their proximity to actual death. That's right. They had turned suicide preparation into a form of performance art where the goal was to demonstrate superior aesthetic sensibility and spiritual sophistication through your approach to self-destruction. It's like if Instagram influencers competed to post the most beautiful suicide notes instead of lifestyle photos. The most extreme form of death poetry competition was the Renzoku-jisei, or consecutive death poem contest, where participants would compose multiple poems over extended periods while gradually escalating their suicide preparations. These events could last for months and often ended with actual deaths as participants felt pressure to follow through on their artistic commitments. Of course, the psychological toll on families and communities was enormous. People were spending enormous amounts of time and creative energy on suicide preparation rather than on living, working, or contributing to society. Entire communities became focused on death aesthetics rather than life enhancement. And yet, the practice persisted because it served important psychological functions within samurai culture. Death poetry competitions provided socially acceptable outlets for expressing despair, uncertainty, and existential anxiety. They offered frameworks for finding meaning and beauty in situations that might otherwise seem pointless and tragic. The irony here is profound. A practice that was supposed to help people find spiritual meaning in death was actually making death more attractive than life. The pursuit of aesthetic and spiritual excellence was undermining the very existence that should have been the foundation for that excellence. Still, before we get too comfortable judging these historical practices, let's consider some modern parallels. We have online communities that romanticize depression, self-harm, and suicide through artistic expression. We have social media platforms where people compete to post the most dramatic content about their mental health struggles. We have artistic movements that celebrate nihilism and death as sophisticated philosophical positions. The difference is that we generally recognize these as concerning psychological phenomena rather than as healthy expressions of spiritual development. Samurai death poetry culture explicitly encouraged proximity to suicide as a form of artistic and spiritual advancement. By the late Edo period, death poetry competitions had become so popular and elaborate that some participants were spending more time on suicide preparation than on actual living. The competitions had evolved from occasional spiritual exercises into regular social events that dominated participants' emotional and creative lives. But here's the fascinating part. Even when participants didn't actually commit suicide, the constant contemplation of death and preparation of death poetry had profound effects on their psychological well-being and life choices. Many became so focused on death aesthetics that they lost interest in normal life activities and relationships. The competitive aspect of death poetry culture was particularly destructive. Different participants would attempt to demonstrate superior spiritual sophistication through more elaborate, more beautiful, or more philosophically complex approaches to suicide preparation. What should have been private spiritual contemplation became public performance designed to impress audiences. If you thought modern poetry competitions were intense, just be grateful that your local writing group doesn't require actual suicide preparation for artistic credibility. Although, given some of the rejection letters I've seen, maybe artistic death is the contemporary equivalent of literal suicide. From aestheticized death preparation, we move to the systematic mutilation of the body for spiritual purposes, practices that transformed Buddhist concepts of non-attachment into elaborate programs of self-harm that would make modern self-injury look like accidental paper cuts. The practice of spiritual mutilation, known as Reisei-kizu, was based on the Buddhist teaching that attachment to the physical body was a barrier to spiritual enlightenment. But samurai culture took this philosophical concept and developed it into concrete practices involving systematic removal of body parts, deliberate scarification, and ritualized self-amputation. Let's be honest about what we're dealing with here. These weren't minor acts of symbolic self-harm or occasional expressions of religious devotion. These were comprehensive programs of body modification that could take years to complete and often resulted in severe disability or death. Imagine if modern spiritual practice required systematically removing pieces of your body to demonstrate religious commitment. The most common form of spiritual mutilation was yubi-kiri, or finger cutting, where practitioners would amputate their own fingers as offerings to Buddhist deities or as demonstrations of non-attachment to physical existence. This wasn't done once as a dramatic gesture. It was done repeatedly, progressively, until some practitioners had removed most of their fingers. To be fair, the theological logic behind spiritual mutilation wasn't entirely irrational within Buddhist philosophy. If the body was indeed a barrier to enlightenment, and if attachment to physical comfort was preventing spiritual progress, then deliberately destroying that comfort could theoretically accelerate spiritual development. But here's where things get truly horrifying. They developed elaborate hierarchies of mutilation that correlated different forms of self-harm with different levels of spiritual advancement. Removing fingertips indicated basic commitment. Removing entire fingers showed serious dedication. Removing hands demonstrated advanced spiritual development. The progression could continue until practitioners had mutilated themselves beyond recognition. The psychological manipulation involved in spiritual mutilation culture was sophisticated and gradual. Practitioners began with minor acts of self-harm that seemed reasonable and spiritually motivated, then gradually escalated to more extreme forms. As they became psychologically invested in the practice and socially committed to demonstrating ever greater spiritual sophistication. Meanwhile, the communities around spiritual mutilation practitioners found themselves complicit in systematic self-destruction. Religious leaders encouraged increasingly extreme acts of self-harm as signs of spiritual progress. Family members supported and celebrated mutilation as evidence of their relative's holiness. Medical practitioners developed techniques for facilitating safe self-amputation rather than discouraging the practices. Sound familiar? We see the same gradual escalation in modern self-harm communities, where people begin with minor cutting or burning and gradually progress to more dangerous forms of self-injury. The difference is that we generally recognize this as mental illness rather than as spiritual advancement. That's right, samurai spiritual culture had normalized progressive self-amputation to such an extent that communities competed to demonstrate who was supporting the most spiritually advanced forms of self-destruction. It was considered evidence of religious sophistication to facilitate your friend's systematic self-mutilation. The most extreme form of spiritual mutilation was Zenshin-kaizu, or whole-body scarification, where practitioners would systematically scar their entire bodies with religious symbols, Buddhist texts, and spiritual imagery. The process could take years and often resulted in infections, disabilities, and deaths from blood loss or sepsis. Of course, the medical consequences of systematic self-mutilation were predictable and horrible. Practitioners regularly died from infections, blood loss, or complications from amateur amputations. But these deaths were often interpreted as evidence of successful spiritual transcendence rather than as evidence that the practices were dangerously extreme. And yet, the most disturbing aspect of spiritual mutilation culture wasn't the physical damage. It was the psychological framework that made systematic self-destruction seem spiritually beneficial. Practitioners genuinely believed that destroying their bodies was the most loving thing they could do for their souls. The irony here is devastating. A philosophical tradition that was supposed to reduce suffering had been transformed into a systematic program for increasing suffering. The pursuit of non-attachment had become an obsessive attachment to self-destruction. Still, before we get too comfortable judging these historical practices, let's consider some modern parallels. We have body modification communities that engage in extreme forms of self-alteration for spiritual or artistic purposes. We have fitness cultures that celebrate exercising through injury and pain. We have therapeutic practices that deliberately expose people to trauma as a form of healing. The difference is that we generally recognize these as individual choices with potential risks, rather than as universally beneficial spiritual practices. Samurai spiritual mutilation culture explicitly encouraged systematic self-harm as a form of religious advancement. By the late Edo period, spiritual mutilation practices had become so extreme and widespread that some Buddhist temples began actively discouraging them, arguing that such practices represented a misunderstanding of Buddhist principles rather than their fulfillment. But here's the fascinating part. Even when religious authorities tried to discourage mutilation practices, practitioners often continued them in private or found alternative spiritual justifications for their self-harm. The practices had become so psychologically and socially embedded that people couldn't simply stop engaging in them. The competitive aspect of spiritual mutilation culture was particularly destructive. Different practitioners would compete to demonstrate superior spiritual commitment through more extreme forms of self-harm. What should have been private spiritual practice became public performance designed to demonstrate religious superiority. If you thought modern body modification was extreme, just be grateful that your spiritual practice doesn't require systematic self-amputation for enlightenment. Although, given some of the wellness trends I've seen, maybe economic self-harm is the contemporary equivalent of spiritual mutilation. From individual spiritual self-destruction, we move to the systematic exploitation of these extreme practices by political authorities, who understood that mass psychological manipulation could be achieved through the deliberate encouragement of ritualized suffering. This political theater of pain transformed personal spiritual practices into instruments of social control that would make modern propaganda look like gentle suggestion. The political exploitation of samurai pain rituals was both sophisticated and cynical. Rulers quickly realized that a population conditioned to find meaning through suffering could be manipulated into accepting almost any political arrangement, as long as it was framed in terms of honor, loyalty, and spiritual development. Let's be clear about what we're dealing with here. This wasn't just opportunistic exploitation of existing cultural practices. This was the deliberate cultivation and amplification of extreme behaviors specifically for political purposes. Rulers actively encouraged increasingly extreme forms of ritualized suffering because suffering populations were easier to control than comfortable ones. The most common form of political theater involving pain rituals was the Kyorushiki, or suffering ceremony, where political authorities would organize mass displays of ritualized self-harm to demonstrate the population's loyalty and the ruler's power. These events could involve thousands of participants and were designed as much for foreign diplomatic audiences as for domestic political control. To be fair, the political logic behind encouraging mass suffering wasn't entirely irrational from a ruler's perspective. Populations that had been conditioned to accept extreme personal sacrifice were less likely to rebel against economic hardship, political oppression, or military demands. If people were already voluntarily torturing themselves, they were unlikely to complain about mere taxation or conscription. But here's where things get truly cynical. Rulers began competing with each other to demonstrate their power through the extremity of the suffering they could inspire in their subjects. Different domains would attempt to outdo each other in organizing spectacular displays of mass self-harm, treating their population's willingness to suffer as a form of political capital. The psychological manipulation involved in political pain theater was comprehensive and systematic. Rulers used religious authority, social pressure, economic incentives, and direct coercion to encourage increasingly extreme displays of loyalty through suffering. The goal was to create populations so psychologically invested in their own pain that they would interpret any reduction in suffering as disloyalty or spiritual failure. Meanwhile, the administrative machinery needed to organize mass suffering. Events became a significant part of government operations. Bureaucracies developed specialized departments for planning pain rituals, training officials in crowd management during mass self-harm events, and coordinating the medical and cleanup operations that followed large-scale suffering displays. Sound familiar? We see the same dynamics in modern political movements that encourage supporters to make increasingly extreme personal sacrifices to demonstrate loyalty to leaders or causes. The difference is that instead of literal self-torture, we usually see economic, social, or career sacrifices that serve similar psychological functions. That's right. They had created government departments specifically dedicated to organizing mass self-torture events as political theater. It's like if modern politicians had cabinet-level positions for coordinating supporters' self-harm as a way of demonstrating political strength. The most extreme form of political pain theater was the Shai-chi, or ruling blood ceremony, where entire populations would be encouraged to participate in synchronized bloodletting events timed to coincide with important political occasions, military victories, diplomatic agreements, or succession ceremonies. Of course, the economic and social costs of systematic political pain theater were enormous. Populations weakened by regular self-harm were less productive, less innovative, and less capable of defending themselves against external threats. But rulers often saw these costs as acceptable prices for maintaining political control and demonstrating power to rivals. And yet, the most disturbing aspect of political pain theater wasn't the physical damage to populations. It was the psychological. framework that made mass suffering seem politically beneficial. Rulers genuinely believed that encouraging systematic self-harm was good governance that strengthened their domains and honored their subjects. The irony here is profound. Political systems that claimed to serve their population's welfare were systematically undermining that welfare through the encouragement of mass self-destruction. The pursuit of political stability was creating instability through population weakening. Still, before we get too comfortable judging these historical practices, let's consider some modern parallels. We have political movements that encourage supporters to make extreme personal sacrifices for ideological causes. We have economic systems that celebrate working yourself into illness as patriotic duty. We have military cultures that glorify suffering as character building and national service. The difference is that we generally recognize these as unfortunate aspects of necessary institutions rather than as the primary goals of political organization. Samurai political culture explicitly aimed to maximize population suffering as a form of governance strategy. By the mid-Edo period, political pain theater had become so elaborate and expensive that some domains began questioning whether the costs were justified by the political benefits. The administrative machinery needed to organize mass suffering events was consuming resources that could have been used for economic development, infrastructure, or defense. But here's the fascinating part. Even when rulers tried to reduce the scale of political pain theater, populations often demanded its continuation. The practices had become so embedded in political identity that reducing them was seen as evidence of weak leadership rather than as humane governance. The competitive aspect of political pain theater was particularly destructive for regional stability. Different domains would compete to demonstrate superior political control through more spectacular displays of population suffering, creating arms races of mass self-harm that served no practical political purpose. If you thought modern political theater was intense, just be grateful that your politicians don't measure their success by how much they can get supporters to torture themselves. Although, given some of the campaign rally behavior I've seen, maybe psychological suffering is the contemporary equivalent of ritualized political pain. As we reach the end of our journey through the blood-soaked, honor-obsessed, and psychologically twisted world of samurai ritual culture, it's worth reflecting on what these practices tell us about human nature, social organization, and our own contemporary relationship with extreme behavior. Let's be honest, the rituals we've explored weren't anomalies or the products of a uniquely disturbed culture. They were the logical endpoints of value systems that exist, in modified form, in virtually every human society. The emphasis on loyalty, honor, group cohesion, and personal sacrifice that drove samurai extremism are fundamental human drives that we still celebrate today. The difference between samurai culture and our own isn't that we've eliminated these drives. It's that we've learned to channel them into less immediately self-destructive forms. Instead of ritual suicide to demonstrate loyalty, we have career sacrifice. Instead of blood oaths, we have corporate team-building exercises. Instead of competitive self-torture, we had extreme sports and social media challenges. What makes samurai ritual culture so fascinating and so disturbing is how it reveals the human capacity for transforming our noblest impulses into our most destructive behaviors. The desire to be loyal, to be honorable, to be spiritually developed, to serve something greater than ourselves. These are genuinely admirable human characteristics. But when these impulses are systematized, institutionalized, and pushed to their logical extremes, they become mechanisms for creating exactly the opposite of what they're supposed to achieve. To be fair, the samurai weren't uniquely susceptible to this kind of moral and psychological distortion. Every human culture that has attempted to systematize virtue has faced similar challenges. the Christian monastics who developed elaborate forms of self-mortification, the Hindu ascetics who pushed bodily denial to the point of death, the communist revolutionaries who turned self-criticism into public humiliation and execution, the capitalist entrepreneurs who turned individual achievement into systematic exploitation. The pattern is always the same. Take a genuine human virtue, create social institutions around it, add competitive pressure and public recognition, then watch as the pursuit of the virtue gradually becomes more important than the virtue itself. Eventually, you end up with systems where people are destroying themselves and others in the name of values that were originally about human flourishing. But here's what makes the samurai case particularly instructive for our contemporary moment. They developed their most extreme rituals during peacetime, not during periods of external threat or social crisis. The blood oaths, the competitive suffering, the family sacrifice rituals, the seasonal blood festivals, all of these reached their peak development during the Tokugawa peace, when Japan was experiencing unprecedented stability, prosperity, and cultural flowering. Sound familiar? We live in an era of remarkable peace and prosperity by historical standards, yet we've developed our own forms of systematic self-destruction disguised as virtue. We have wellness cultures that promote extreme dietary restrictions as spiritual purification. We have fitness communities that celebrate exercising through injury as character development. We have work cultures that glorify burnout as professional dedication. Meanwhile, our social media platforms have created competitive suffering environments that would be familiar to any samurai participating in honor competitions. People compete to post the most extreme content about their struggles, their sacrifices, their commitment to various causes. The platforms reward extreme content with attention and validation, creating incentive structures that push people toward increasingly dramatic forms of self-presentation. That's right, we've accidentally recreated the psychological dynamics of samurai honor culture in digital form. Instead of competing to endure physical torture while maintaining composure, we compete to endure psychological torture while maintaining our online personas. The medium has changed, but the underlying human drives remain remarkably consistent. Most sobering aspect of studying samurai ritual culture is recognizing how many of the psychological mechanisms that drove their extremism are still operating in our own society. The need for social belonging, the desire to demonstrate virtue, the fear of being seen as weak or uncommitted, the tendency to escalate competitive behaviors. None of these have disappeared from human psychology. Of course, there are important differences between samurai extremism and contemporary forms. We have medical knowledge that prevents many of the worst physical consequences of extreme behavior. We have legal systems that limit the most dangerous forms of competitive suffering. We have psychological frameworks that help us recognize and address destructive behavioral patterns. And yet, before we get too comfortable feeling superior to historical samurai culture, let's acknowledge some uncomfortable parallels. We have economic systems that regularly drive people to suicide through financial stress. We have educational systems that create competitive pressure so intense that students regularly suffer psychological breakdowns. We have healthcare systems that often prioritize profit over human welfare, leading to systematic neglect of human suffering. Still, perhaps the most important lesson from samurai ritual culture isn't about the dangers of extreme behavior. It's about the importance of maintaining perspective on our values and institutions. The samurai didn't set out to create a culture of systematic self-destruction. They were trying to build a society based on loyalty, honor, courage, and spiritual development. These are genuinely admirable goals. The problem came when they lost sight of the ultimate purpose of these values, human flourishing, and became obsessed with the values themselves as abstract principles that could be pursued regardless. of their human consequences. Loyalty became more important than the people you were supposed to be loyal to. Honor became more important than the community honor was supposed to serve. Spiritual development became more important than the actual spirits being developed. By the time the Meiji Restoration ended the samurai era in 1868, even many samurai recognized that their ritual culture had become counterproductive to its own stated goals. The extreme practices that were supposed to create superior warriors had instead created a class of people so psychologically damaged and socially dysfunctional that they were unable to adapt to changing circumstances or serve their societies. Actual needs. The irony is profound. A culture that was obsessed with strength and effectiveness had made itself weak and ineffective through its obsession with demonstrating strength and effectiveness. The pursuit of virtue had become so divorced from the practical benefits of virtue that it was undermining the very society it was supposed to strengthen. If there's a lesson here for our contemporary moment, it might be this: be suspicious of any system that asks you to demonstrate your commitment to human values through actions that harm humans, including yourself. Be wary of institutions that turn virtue into competition, that treat suffering as evidence of character, that prioritize abstract principles over concrete human welfare. The samurai weren't monsters. They were people trying to live meaningful lives according to the best values their culture could offer them. The tragedy is that their culture's values became so systematized and extremized that following them conscientiously led to systematic self-destruction. We face similar challenges today with our own cultural values. The question isn't whether we should abandon concepts like loyalty, honor, achievement, or spiritual development. It's whether we can pursue these values in ways that actually serve human flourishing rather than undermining it. Perhaps the ultimate lesson of samurai ritual culture is that the price of virtue is constant vigilance against virtue's own excesses. The most dangerous threats to human welfare often come not from people who reject our values, but from people who embrace them so completely that they lose sight of why those values matter in the first place. And on that cheerful note, I think we can say we've successfully descended into the depths of human civilization's capacity for transforming the sacred into the horrific, the noble into the destructive, and the meaningful into the completely insane. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You now know more about ritualized suffering than any reasonable person should ever need to know. But hey, at least it puts your own life's problems into perspective. Having a bad day at work? At least your job doesn't require ritual disembowelment for minor mistakes. Frustrated with your family? At least they don't expect you to commit suicide if your uncle embarrasses the family name. Stressed about social media pressure? At least your online presence doesn't require actual bloodletting for authenticity. The samurai may have been many things: dedicated, disciplined, culturally sophisticated, artistically accomplished, but they were also living proof that it's possible to be completely committed to your values while being completely wrong about what those values should actually require of you. In a world that often seems obsessed with extreme behavior and performative virtue, that might be the most relevant lesson of all. So the next time someone tells you that you need to suffer more to prove your commitment to something, remember the samurai. Remember that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is refuse to turn virtue into a competitive blood sport. Remember that true strength might involve knowing when not to demonstrate your strength. True loyalty might involve questioning what you're being loyal to. And true honor might involve having the courage to admit when your culture's definition of honor has become completely insane. And if all else fails, just remember, at least you live in an era where team-building exercises usually don't involve actual torture. Usually. The psychology of systematic extremism. Wait, we're not quite done exploring this rabbit hole of human behavioral extremism. Because understanding how an entire civilization could normalize systematic self-destruction requires us to dig deeper into the psychological mechanisms that made these practices not just possible, but inevitable within their cultural context. Let's be clear about something that might not be immediately obvious from our previous exploration. The samurai weren't psychopaths. They weren't sadists who enjoyed inflicting pain on themselves and others. They weren't culturally backward people who didn't understand the value of human life. They were, by the standards of their time, among the most educated, sophisticated, and morally conscious people in the world. That's what makes their ritual culture so profoundly disturbing and so relevant to our contemporary situation. These weren't the practices of obviously disturbed individuals or primitive societies. They were the logical products of sophisticated moral reasoning applied within a specific cultural and psychological framework. To understand how this happened, we need to examine what psychologists now recognize as the fundamental mechanisms of moral reasoning and social conformity that operate in all human societies, including our own. The samurai didn't develop their extreme practices in isolation. They developed them through the same psychological processes that we used to develop our own moral systems and social practices. The first key mechanism is what modern psychology calls moral foundation theory. The idea that human moral reasoning is built on a limited number of fundamental psychological foundations that exist across all cultures. These include care, harm, fairness, cheating, loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, sanctity, degradation, and liberty, oppression. Every human society develops its moral systems by prioritizing different combinations of these foundations and creating specific practices designed to honor them. The problem comes when societies become so focused on honoring abstract moral foundations that they lose sight of the practical human consequences of their moral practices. Samurai culture provides a perfect case study in how this process can go catastrophically wrong. They took the loyalty-betrayal foundation and developed it to such an extreme that loyalty obligations regularly required the destruction of everything that loyalty was supposed to protect: families, communities, and individual lives. Meanwhile, they took the sanctity-degradation foundation and created purification practices so extreme that the pursuit of spiritual purity became more destructive than the spiritual contamination it was supposed to address. They took the authority-subversion foundation and developed hierarchical systems so rigid that serving authority required systematic self-annihilation. Sound familiar? We see the same pattern in contemporary political and social movements that become so obsessed with abstract principles that they lose sight of practical human consequences. Environmental movements that prioritize abstract ecological purity over human welfare. Social justice movements that become so focused on ideological correctness that they destroy the communities they're supposed to help. Economic systems that prioritize abstract market efficiency over actual human flourishing. The second key mechanism is what psychologists call system justification, the human tendency to develop psychological explanations that make existing social arrangements seem reasonable and beneficial, even when those arrangements are clearly harmful to the people living within them. Samurai culture developed elaborate theological and philosophical justifications for practices that were obviously destructive to human welfare. They created sophisticated arguments for why suffering was spiritually beneficial, why loyalty required self-destruction, why honor demanded family annihilation. These weren't simple rationalizations. They were comprehensive worldviews that made extreme behavior seem not just acceptable, but morally required. The psychological sophistication of these justifications is what made them so effective and so dangerous. Simple brutality can be recognized and resisted. But when brutality is wrapped in sophisticated moral philosophy, spiritual justification, and cultural tradition, it becomes much harder to oppose, especially for people who are living within the system and have been raised to accept its fundamental assumptions. Of course, we see exactly the same mechanism operating in our contemporary society. We have elaborate economic theories that justify systematic inequality and suffering as necessary for overall prosperity. We have political philosophies that justify extreme measures in pursuit of abstract goals like security, freedom, or justice. We have therapeutic and wellness theories that justify various forms of self-harm as personally beneficial. The third key mechanism is what social psychologists call social proof, the tendency for people to determine appropriate behavior by observing what others are doing, especially others who are similar to themselves or who have higher social status. In samurai society, extreme ritual behavior wasn't just accepted, it was modeled and celebrated by the most respected members of the community. When the people you look up to are engaging in systematic self-torture, when the people you want to be like are demonstrating their virtue through extreme suffering, when the people whose approval you need are evaluating you based on your willingness to engage in destructive practices, those practices start to seem not just normal, but desirable. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of samurai ritual culture. It shows how quickly and completely normal human psychology can be redirected towards systematic self-destruction when the social environment provides the right combination of modeling, incentives, and justifications. And yet, before we get too comfortable feeling superior to historical samurai culture, let's acknowledge how the same mechanism operates in our contemporary environment. Social media platforms create environments where extreme behavior is rewarded with attention and validation. Celebrity culture models increasingly dramatic forms of self-presentation and personal revelation. Political movements reward increasingly extreme demonstrations of ideological commitment. The fourth key mechanism is what psychologists call escalation of commitment, the tendency for people to increase their investment in failing courses of action rather than admitting mistakes and changing direction. This is the psychological process that transforms initially reasonable practices into increasingly extreme and destructive ones. Samurai ritual culture provides a perfect example of escalation of commitment on a civilizational scale. What began as reasonable practices for building group loyalty and individual discipline gradually escalated into systematic programs of self-destruction, because admitting that the practices had become counterproductive would have required abandoning the entire cultural framework that gave samurai life meaning and purpose. Each generation had to escalate the extremity of their practices to demonstrate that they were as committed as their predecessors. Each individual had to escalate their own behavior to maintain their position within increasingly competitive social hierarchies. Each community had to escalate their ritual practices to maintain their reputation relative to neighboring communities. The result was a culture trapped in a cycle of competitive self-destruction where everyone knew the practices were becoming increasingly harmful, but no one could afford to be the first to acknowledge that fact publicly. It's like a massive cultural version of the sunk cost fallacy, where entire societies continue investing in destructive practices because they've already invested so much that admitting failure seems impossible. Still, perhaps the most important psychological mechanism underlying samurai ritual extremism was what we might call meaning-making through suffering, the human tendency to find purpose and significance in difficult experiences by interpreting them as spiritually or morally beneficial. This isn't inherently problematic. In fact, it's one of humanity's most valuable psychological capabilities. The ability to find meaning in suffering is what allows people to endure genuine hardship, to grow from difficult experiences, and to maintain hope and purpose in the face of life's inevitable challenges. But when this psychological capability is systematized and institutionalized, it can become a mechanism for justifying and perpetuating unnecessary suffering. If suffering is inherently meaningful and spiritually beneficial, then creating suffering becomes a virtuous activity rather than a harmful one. Samurai culture took this natural human capability and built an entire civilization around it. They created systematic programs for generating meaningful suffering, elaborate theories about the spiritual benefits of different types of pain, and competitive social structures that rewarded increasingly extreme forms of self-inflicted hardship. Tragedy is that this approach actually worked, at least partially and temporarily. People who went through extreme ritual ordeals often did develop extraordinary psychological resilience, deep spiritual insights, and powerful social bonds with others who had shared similar experiences. The practices weren't completely irrational. They were partially effective approaches to human development that had been pushed far beyond their optimal limits. To be fair, we see similar dynamics in many contemporary contexts that we generally consider positive. Military training deliberately uses controlled suffering to build character and group cohesion. Athletic training requires pushing through pain and discomfort to achieve performance goals. Therapeutic interventions often involve deliberately confronting painful experiences to promote psychological growth. The difference is that we generally try to calibrate these practices to achieve specific beneficial outcomes while minimizing unnecessary harm. We use controlled suffering as a means to an end, rather than treating suffering itself as the end goal. Samurai culture lost this calibration. They became so focused on the spiritual and social benefits of suffering that they forgot to ask whether specific practices were actually producing those benefits, or whether the benefits were worth the costs, or whether there might be less harmful ways to achieve the same goals. Meanwhile, the competitive dynamics within samurai society created powerful incentives for escalating the intensity of suffering practices, regardless of their actual effectiveness. When your social status depends on demonstrating superior commitment through more extreme practices, you're not motivated to question whether those practices are actually beneficial. You're motivated to find ways to make them even more extreme. That's right. They had created social structures that systematically discouraged rational evaluation of their own practices. It's like if scientific research was conducted through competitive self-torture rather than careful observation and analysis. The methodology was fundamentally incompatible with discovering whether it was actually working. Of course, this creates a profound paradox for contemporary societies trying to learn from historical examples like samurai culture. On one hand, we want to avoid the obvious mistakes of systematic extremism and institutionalized self-destruction. On the other hand, we don't want to abandon the genuine human values and capabilities that these practices were attempting to develop, even if they pursued them in destructive ways. The challenge is figuring out how to honor values like loyalty, courage, spiritual development, and social cohesion without falling into the psychological traps that led samurai culture towards systematic extremism. How do we build character without building character disorders? How do we encourage commitment without encouraging fanaticism? How do we develop resilience without developing destructive behaviors? And yet, this challenge is made more difficult by the fact that the psychological mechanisms underlying samurai extremism are still operating in our contemporary society. We still have the same human needs for meaning, belonging, and moral purpose that drove samurai ritual development. We still have the same tendencies towards social conformity, escalation of commitment, and system justification that made extreme practices seem reasonable and beneficial. The question isn't whether we can eliminate these psychological mechanisms. They're fundamental aspects of human nature that we need for healthy individual and social functioning. The question is whether we can organize our social institutions in ways that channel these mechanisms toward genuinely beneficial outcomes rather than toward systematic self-destruction. Still, before we get too optimistic about our ability to avoid the mistakes of historical samurai culture, let's acknowledge some uncomfortable parallels in our contemporary situation. We have social media platforms that reward increasingly extreme forms of self-presentation and ideological commitment. We have political movements that treat questioning group orthodoxy as betrayal. We have economic systems that require systematic self-sacrifice for abstract goals, like growth and efficiency. We have wellness cultures that promote increasingly extreme forms of dietary restriction, exercise regimens, and self-optimization as spiritual and moral imperatives. We have work cultures that glorify burnout and self-sacrifice as professional virtues. We have educational systems that create competitive pressure so intense that students regularly suffer psychological breakdown in pursuit of academic achievement. The mechanisms are remarkably similar to those that drove samurai ritual extremism. The main difference is that our forms of systematic self-destruction are more subtle, more distributed across different domains of life, and more disguised as individual choice rather than cultural obligation. If there's hope to be found in studying samurai ritual culture, it might be in recognizing that these practices eventually became so obviously counterproductive that even people within the system began to question and modify them. The Meiji Restoration didn't just end samurai political power, it represented a cultural awakening to the destructive consequences of their ritual extremism. But this awakening required external pressure from contact with other societies that had organized themselves differently, internal recognition that their practices were undermining their own stated goals, and alternative frameworks for achieving the same human values through less destructive means. Perhaps the most important lesson is that avoiding systematic extremism requires constant vigilance against our own most cherished values when they start to become divorced from their practical human benefits. It requires willingness to question practices that have become traditional and comfortable, to evaluate institutions based on their actual outcomes rather than their stated intentions, and to prioritize concrete human welfare over abstract principles. Most importantly, it requires recognizing that the greatest threats to human flourishing often come not from people who reject our values, but from people who embrace our values so completely and systematically that they lose sight of why those values matter in the first place. The samurai weren't evil. They were good people trying to live meaningful lives according to the best values their society could offer them. The tragedy is that their society's values had become so systematized and extremized that pursuing them conscientiously led to systematic human destruction. We face similar challenges today with our own cultural values and social institutions. The question isn't whether we should abandon concepts like achievement, loyalty, spiritual development, or social responsibility. It's whether we can pursue these values in ways that actually serve human flourishing rather than undermining it. And on that note, perhaps we can finally say we've thoroughly explored the depths of human civilization's capacity for transforming virtue into vice, meaning into madness, and sacred into profane. The samurai legacy serves as both inspiration and warning, a reminder of humanity's extraordinary capacity for both nobility and horror, often expressed simultaneously in the same cultural practices. So the next time you encounter a social movement, cultural practice, or institutional system that claims to serve high moral purposes through extreme measures, remember the samurai. Remember that the road to systematic human destruction is often paved with the very best of human intentions, and that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is insist that your values actually serve the human beings they're supposed to benefit. After all, true virtue isn't demonstrated through suffering. It's demonstrated through the reduction of unnecessary suffering. True loyalty isn't proven through self-destruction. It's proven through building and protecting what you're loyal to. True honor isn't achieved through extreme measures. It's achieved through consistently choosing human welfare over abstract principles, even when that choice requires admitting that your culture's traditional practices might need to change. The samurai may have created one of history's most sophisticated and beautiful cultures, but they also created one of its most systematically self-destructive ones. We can honor their genuine achievements while learning from their genuine mistakes, and perhaps, in doing so, avoid repeating them in our own sophisticated and subtle ways.